Okay, so hello, folks. I am Rick Repetti, professor of philosophy at City University of New York in Brooklyn at the Kingsborough Community College campus. And here with me today is a former student of mine from that school originally, well, among other schools that he attended, Edin Cekic.
Yes, Cekic.
Cekic, yes. I
Yes.
never knew how to pronounce your name when you were in my class. Um, and he is a high school science teacher in New York City, also in Brooklyn. Um, and would you like to say anything else about your background, just for our viewers when people show up to watch this?
Yeah, I also run the chess club at my school as well, and I've been teaching chess as well for some years.
Oh, that's great. Oh, good. Then I won't try to play chess with you because I'm a novice. I used to like playing it when I was a teenager, but I never really stayed with it. So I have like beginner baby skills. All right, so I forget which one of us proposed the topic. I think we might have bounced it back and forth. You might have been a little bit more interested in this. I've talked about it elsewhere. I do philosophical counseling, which is kind of like, but not quite like, psychotherapeutic counseling. Um, and we've talked a little bit about that, and we both know that there's some curiosity and confusion about how those are alike and different. And then the larger question is about various different types of talking therapies and psychological or psychotherapeutic approaches and whatnot, and how to understand them and how they differ and how they're alike. Is that correct? Is that what we agreed to talk about?
Yep, that's you got it.
Okay, so I guess I'll start out by trying to describe some of the major ways that philosophical counseling differs from traditional therapies. You can count it as a kind of talking therapy, only it's not necessarily a therapy. So, this is one of the things that's distinctive, I think, about it. Um, it can function as a therapy. It depends on what you mean by therapy. Usually, when we think of therapy, we think of somebody who needs some kind of assistance with some kind of health issue, right? Like physical therapy. Okay, you have a back problem or you broke a leg, you need to learn how to walk again, you need therapy, right? I apologize for the dings if that's on my side. Um, I don't know how to control that. I've tried very hard. Um, but so similarly with psychological therapy or psychotherapy, the, the term therapy implies some kind of pathology, some kind of health condition that needs to be addressed through therapy. So now people come to philosophical counseling not necessarily for therapy. They come just to have philosophical discussions. Now, they might have certain issues that they'll bring to philosophical counseling that they might also bring to their therapist. Like, it depends. If they are at a crossroads in their career and are uncertain about what, they might need some help sorting out their values, their sense of self, making decisions about major life paths, go this way or go that way. They might be torn with a moral decision. They might be contemplating divorce or change of career. Or they might just have a philosophical curiosity and want to have a dialogue with a philosopher the way that people around Socrates had philosophical dialogues that helped them to understand issues that they were confronting, in some deeper way. So, they could come to a philosophical counselor with a problem or an issue, and some of those things they may or may not involve something that could be called pathology or a problem, that's something that needs therapy or just counseling. That's why we call ourselves philosophical counselors. We're educators, we're philosophers, but here's one way in which is a misleading phrase, but it's also helpful. And I'll sort out the two different aspects of it. There's a book by one of the founders of this movement in the United States, Lou Marinoff, whose first bestseller on philosophical counseling was called Plato, Not Prozac, right? Philosophy, not medication, in other words. But the book that I'm referring to, the title of, is Therapy for the Sane. All right, so he's using the word therapy, but saying that it's for sane people. Now, that's helpful because you can be a perfectly healthy, balanced person in your life, and you still want to have you want to go through some kind of therapeutic process. It could just be for self-development, self-inquiry, examination, self-betterment, whatever, self-transformation. And so you want to go through a process of kind of philosophical exploration and growth with a professional philosopher who's like a psychotherapist, right? But what's bad about that phrase, what's misleading about it, is that it implies that people who go for traditional forms of psychotherapy are not sane. And that's not true. People who are sane often need a little help if they're going through a divorce or whatever, and they'll just go to a psychotherapist that specializes in family issues or whatever, right? So those are some of the ways in which philosophical counseling is similar to, but differs from, traditional psychotherapy. I'll say a couple more things, and then I'll let you, interject with questions or comments. Excuse me. There are now considered traditional psychotherapies that have recently become modalities in the psychology world, like cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive therapy, logotherapy, existential therapy. All of those are taken right out of philosophy. They're just taking philosophy and using it in a psychotherapeutic setting. All right, cognitive behavioral therapy, by the way, and mindfulness, meditative practices, those things are being brought in. That comes out of Buddhism, right? So there's so many kind of what we call psychotechnologies, right? Like even reading and writing are psychotechnologies. They are technologies that help you improve your mind in some way, shape, or form, or grow in some way. You can manage a lot more information if you can read and write, and you can retain it and access it and so on. So psychotechnology could be reading and writing, but it could be how to meditate or whatever. All sorts of things can count as psychotechnologies. So the last half a dozen new psychotechnologies that have been exapted from philosophy into psychology, are kind of themselves arguments, not explicitly, but implicitly, they count as premises for the claim that philosophy can function quite well as a form of psychotherapy, right? Because it's already happening, and psychologists are becoming more and more inclined to use philosophical tools and modalities, format their therapy based on these philosophical principles. But cognitive behavioral therapy research has shown in the last couple of decades that it's the most effective form of psychotherapy, but it's extracted straight out of Stoicism. All of the ideas in cognitive behavioral therapy come out of the ancient Greek philosophy of the Stoics. So that's what I say. One of the other differences is that the American Psychological Association credentializes psychotherapy, and they don't recognize philosophical counseling under their aegis, and insurance companies won't pay for it. I say yet, because maybe they will someday. But even some of the other forms of psychotherapy that are, what are they called? Positive psychology, right? Psychology for the longest time was focused on pathologies. But positive psychology is focusing more on wellness and preventative mental health, right? So what kinds of things help people to remain healthy before they get sick mentally, let's just say, right? And insurance companies will pay for those things through the psychologists, but not yet through the philosophical counselors because of this like a kind of turf war, and this like getting things credentialed and approved is just a huge political, social, economic kind of mess. Um, but like in Europe, in many countries, medical insurance doesn't pay for psychological counseling anyway. So there's no control over philosophical counseling by psychologists, let's just say, in Europe or in Israel and other countries, you know. So this is more like in the United States, this kind of little bit of a turf war. So that's my intro to what philosophical counseling is and how it's like but unlike regular psychological. And one other thing I'll throw in there is that psychologists tend to focus on emotions, history, trauma, childhood, you know, as a kind of place to look for the cause of a person's like failure of functionality, or not, you know, they're not optimally functioning in society, or their mental illness or whatever it is. Let's go back and see what went wrong in your past, right? But that's not, certainly a philosopher could have that conversation with somebody, but that's not a primary. Not and also psychologists, like I said, they focus on emotions and helping clients kind of handle their emotions. And they're also very relativistic. Like, no matter what the client brings, the psychologist's job is not to bring value judgments into the arena, right? But philosophers will do that. And psychologists normally try to just create a safe environment in which a client can turn the psychotherapist into a kind of confidant and unload things and have no judgment and feel safe and everything. And then the psychologist is going to kind of just generally help the client maintain stability or fit in with society, function better in society. But philosophical counselors are more Socratic, like they're willing to challenge their clients, challenge even their clients' desire to simply maintain the status quo, whatever it is. They're philosophers, so they're going to challenge their clients' beliefs. They're not so interested in making their clients psychologically comfortable. So those are some of the things I would say right off the bat.
You touched upon many things here.
Yes, I did.
That deserve a say, a word or two. I mean, first of all, I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I'm definitely going to, give it my thought, based on what we already know, I would say, and from the ancient texts to the modern psychological understanding, which is also not really that old, modern psychology, as opposed to ancient philosophy to begin with.
Right.
But there's this little piece of cartoon art from the Mind Journal that I remember, and it said something like, people in therapy are often in therapy to deal with the people in their lives who won't go to therapy. So the idea there is that from the psychology perspective, if you're going to go to therapy, there's a very good chance that you have some kind of conflict. You're not necessarily trying to solve a problem or discover something, but you're having a conflict oftentimes with another individual or yourself with certain type of addictions, that you may have, that you're trying to battle with. And you mentioned Socrates earlier. I mean, Socrates, as you well know, said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So if you take it from the philosophical perspective, there is a necessary push to examine what you do in your life, your habits, the structure that you've built. Does it work? Does it not work? Why? And oftentimes in the ancient world, I think when we think of philosophy, people want to understand how things work, and of course, inventions come into play. We can talk about anything from the alarm clock, that was invented by possibly Plato, and to the watermill, that was also another ancient Greek invention. But this stemmed from wanting to know, from wanting to understand, from questioning. So I think that there is that aspect of therapy, and the reason why I would call it a therapy is because once you discovered the answer to the question, because you've taken certain steps to this discovery, this brings about a certain type of healing, of mental satisfaction. But you can take it, of course, further steps if you cannot solve the problem. But I think when we're talking about psychological therapy, which you mentioned earlier, there's definitely a very clear distinction. As I mentioned, it's often an issue that one may have within themselves, possibly a addiction, some issues that they have with other people, which are clearly inhibiting them from being productive in their life, from achieving certain goals. There's an interesting fact, actually, a data that was taken in this country back in 2022, which is this current year, and it states that about 19.86% of American adults are experiencing mental illnesses. So that's about like 50 million people. And they do not go to philosophers. They're not trying to solve problems that they may have that are focusing on the natural world. Their focus is an internal struggle, an addiction, conflicts, alcoholism, drug use, substance abuse, etc. So I think there is a very clear distinction there, because if we were to take it a little bit more further, maybe to mention, for example, Carl Jung in this conversation, the idea would be, again, for as he called it, an in-depth analytical form of therapy. It's designed to bring together conscious and the unconscious parts of the mind so that you can help to become a balanced individual. Because oftentimes what happens in your life is you may be thrown off balance, and that could be due to something that you're experiencing that is causing you issues to continue to progress in your life, to do daily activities. It could be anything from trying to sleep to eating properly. It could be things that you're dealing with in your daily life. As you mentioned before, it could be counseling with marriage, or one of the worst parts is, if you were traumatized as a young child, which is, if it does not get a adequate type of therapy during a specific amount of time, then that child will continue to struggle in their life because they have still not received that type of psychological healing, so to speak, which is focused on the whole self, which is focused on that balance.
Yeah. So you've also said a lot of interesting things. I'll pick up on just a little bit, and we can go back and forth spontaneously as whatever strikes our interest as more or less salient to what we know or could add to. So all those examples that you gave make sense. They were almost all of them more in the domain of psychology than in the domain of philosophy on their face. But I could imagine even many of them in context, if we knew the full story, might be better approached through a philosophical lens And the cause of them might be what you might want to say are faulty assumptions, faulty premises, faulty background beliefs, faulty worldview, faulty values, confused values, competing values that haven't been sorted out, the lack of a coherent philosophical perspective. An individual might just be kind of all over the place because they've never really made a conscientious effort to figure out, what do I believe? What do I value? What matters most to me? What kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want to be? What are my standards? Am I living up to my standards? And almost everything that I just said in the last half a minute or so, those are clearly philosophical. Those are things that are germane to philosophical analysis. So somebody might be on its face, superficially, so to speak, from a philosophical perspective, suffering from anxiety or depression, or both, back and forth, flipping between anxiety and depression. But the causes of those might not be chemical or traumatic, post-traumatic, or anything like that. They might be just a kind of existential confusion, right? Like, who am I? Why am I here? That's all kind of unanswered stuff. So their lives are just kind of unfolding mindlessly, almost like sleepwalking through life. And they don't have any kind of healthy practices, let's just say, that might contribute to their overall wholesome functioning. And so they're experiencing what you might want to call, what I like to call, existential indigestion, just like food indigestion. They're watching crappy programming on television. They're playing bad video games, things that just jar them in many different ways. And like their lives are lacking meaning and substance. And so they experience that as, flipping between boredom and anxiety, or, depression and anxiety, or being hyper and being manic, being moody, and and then the school teacher might say, or they might even be diagnosed. You have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Why? Well, you're an adolescent, you're jumping around, you have a lot of energy. That doesn't mean it's a pathology, not necessarily, right? But millions of American children are being put on Ritalin and other drugs like that because they are jumpy and they don't focus, but they weren't raised in a way that they can really flourish in an educational environment. They have no discipline at home in their lives, right? So there are many ways in which the causes of many of the things that wind up bringing people to a psychologist might actually also be addressed in a fruitful way by a philosopher. It depends. Depends. If the anxiety is something like, all right, somebody has severe anxiety or severe depression, that they might actually be benefited from psychopharmacological, therapy, that they need some kind of medication to help stabilize their brain. But given the amount of prescription drugs that are being given to the number, I mean, it's the numbers alone seem like that's not necessarily. It's hard to believe that meant those many millions of American children are chemically imbalanced and need to be chemically treated, right? So from a philosophical counseling perspective, we're very critical of those numbers. Not to say that we don't want to help people, and often enough that it might be good to level off somebody by adjusting their brain chemistry, but you might be treating the effect and not the cause, is what I'm saying. If the cause is some kind of existential or philosophical confusion, it's conceivable that that's going on.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things, of course, and you spoke about children, and again, we went back to the analysis of philosophy and its role to, simply question, like regardless of what the premise is, of what the statement is, of what the treatment is. It should be questioned, which of course is a very practical approach, nonetheless. I think that first, um, of course, I want to go back to the ancient world. I think that's a very important time period because we are talking about um, the philosophical approach to therapy, you know, um, and if you remember, of course, Archimedes, one of the very big ancient inventors, discovering that water screw, which is able to drive water upward. And it's interesting because from one perspective, we do not know this, of course, because Archimedes was not psychoanalyzed by anybody, but it would be very difficult or nearly impossible to make a statement that Archimedes was not in some type of mental struggle to try to figure out how to drive water up the hill. But when he did discover it, there is that big saying, of course, when he said, Eureka, right? He jumped on the streets. He was very excited. He jumped out of his bath, ran naked through the streets, supposedly. So he felt good. He felt mentally good. So if a person is feeling mentally good, the question is, can the argument be made from the philosophical perspective that this person has experienced, for whatever brief moment, some sort of therapy? I think that would be one question that I have based on Archimedes' discovery and his reaction to his discovery.
So this is why I said the word therapy is a little vague and ambiguous, right? It normally sounds like it's medicinal, and therefore it's a response to some kind of illness or injury or pathology, right? But I wouldn't describe the scientific mind, in the grip of curiosity, trying to solve puzzles, as pathological. Now, I might be biased in favor of the scientific method and philosophical curiosity and all of that, but I'm not sure what you're suggesting. So maybe Eureka. Okay, so when you are a scientist or a philosopher and you're in the grip of a problem, your psyche, your mind, is consciously confused, doesn't understand something, has curiosity, wants to understand it, and that has a volitional, meaning intentional component. I want to understand. Some people are confused and they don't care to try to resolve the confusion, right? So there's a kind of wholesomeness in the mind that wants to know the truth, right? I wouldn't call that pathological, although it could resemble pathology when you see the mad scientist not sleeping for 72 hours, with his hair disheveled and everything, and then like, Eureka, running down the street naked. That seems a little nuts, right? So, but it might be what psychologists do call catharsis, like a kind of healing moment that completion has happened, something is released, I'm good now, or something like that. So were you wondering, because of that parallel, if he was suffering, or were you wondering, because of these parallels, that he might have been in some kind of actual therapy that helped him to get there? Which of those two things, or both of them? What were you thinking when you... Is my question even clear to you?
I would say yes. I mean, you took it from two different perspectives. The way that I understood it is that if you are in the brink of discovery and you have started with a question, um, at that point you've already identified the problem that you're trying to solve. So we've already done that step. And I think this is the point which differentiates philosophical therapy from the psychological therapy or the psychotherapy or the psychiatry. Because oftentimes the individual that is going through psychotherapy or psychological therapy, they may not admit that they have a specific issue. They may be in denial of this,
Or
or,
confusion. Yeah.
or a specific type of confusion. So one can say, just like in a phylogenetic tree, this is where we start to split.
Very
Uh,
good. Let me
on,
interject. Let me interject to see if I'm following you so far. Because you did intimate something about this earlier. That people who seek psychology, generally, what motivates them is something's not working in their lives. They've got some kind of conflict. Whereas people who seek philosophical guidance or people of a scientific or philosophical mindset, they're more driven by problems and curiosity and a desire to understand and to know. So that's a different. There's similarities. There's functional similarities in their behavior and whatnot, which you see in like catharsis and eureka. Right? They're very similar. There's some kind of release. There's some kind of tension in both when you're struggling to solve a problem or when you're struggling with a conflict that you don't understand. So there are these behavioral or external similarities that are perhaps somewhat superficial, but yeah, is that what you're trying to say?
well, yes, and I want to relate it back to the phylogenetic tree because when you take a look in a phylogenetic tree in biology, one thing that you will notice with a phylogenetic tree that there is, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, there is a common ancestor. So what is that common ancestor, which then psychology and philosophy branch out of? And I think that's
Good.
that's the big question, of course. Um, uh, that we can, of course, talk about. But you also mentioned, of course, children with ADHD, and the fact that sometimes they are prescribed with certain types of drugs uh, to feel better. Oftentimes, this could be methylphenidate, if I'm not mistaken, if that's the name of the drug that
Amphetamines, yeah.
that is prescribed for them. But again, this opens up many questions, of course, because in order for us to understand why um, certain types of professionals in education try to push this on young children or even teenagers, we have to understand in context what is happening inside of the school culture. What are they trying to achieve? Because only then will we understand why they would want to push uh, something as a certain type of methylphenidate on a child, if we already have evidence that states that especially in boys there is going to be that hyperactive hypertension activity. Not necessarily hypertension, but definitely hyperactive, of course. Not hypertension, but hyperactive. That hyperactiveness is a natural aspect of growth and development. And
Yeah.
so if you as an educator does not know a way on how to approach and teach a child who is being natural in their development,
And medicating them.
other than medicating them, then this becomes a different type of problem, because now you're saying that, you know, that child
Human nature.
is not being natural, and there's a imbalance, going back to what Jung said about what therapy is, being in a state of psychological, balance as a whole. And so
Yeah.
and
Well,
so it's a very big problem. It's a very serious problem, because in order to understand it, again, you have to understand what is the culture, what is the school trying to achieve? Is the school susceptible to evidence that suggests that there are approaches, specific approaches to utilize for students who are having hyperactive behavior, or cannot control certain types of impulses? Um, the interesting thing is that it all goes back to developing certain habits as well. So if you're doing something consistently, it's because you developed a specific type of habit, so you're continuing to do it. And the thing is that it is difficult for people that you come across with in your life to continue to tell you, especially if they see you 5 days a week, that this habit may be prohibiting you from being more productive, from reaching a higher grade. So what they do, instead of understanding this, they try to feed the medication, which is not a resolution, because
it's
it's
a
a
symptom.
natural aspect
It's a
of
symptom
developmental
control.
growth.
I'm sorry?
Because it's a natural aspect of children's developmental growth, especially for boys.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, it's a behavioral modification drug, and it's also treating a symptom. But the word symptom also is erroneous if, in fact, being rambunctious is a normal physiological response for a young male human being. Because yeah, I think the statistics are that males are more highly medicated than females are, and that's probably due to their behavior being disruptive in the classroom. So yeah, this is kind of like just domesticating them artificially without teaching them ways of managing their own mental and physical states, which is just a failure of attention in upbringing, right? Whether it's on the part of the educators or the parents or the society as a whole, right? If millions of children are being, in my opinion, misdiagnosed as if there's something wrong with them when they just haven't been properly prepared to benefit from an educational system, then medicating them isn't helping them at all. It's just minimizing the risk and the disturbances for the society. And of course, I hate to be conspiratorial, but you don't have to. Conspiracy theorists often say they're doing it on purpose. They have bad motives. They planned this, right? But I always tell people who come across as conspiracy theorists that the intentions don't matter. If you've set something in motion that's functioning and benefiting the system in some way, right? There's a feedback loop that's going to make sure that that keeps happening, right? So the pharmacology companies, the insurance companies, the school, they're all benefiting in some way from the mass drugging of American children, right? So this is like, it doesn't matter if they did it intentionally, right? Or knowingly, or just out of ignorance, but they wouldn't let it continue if it wasn't paying off on some level that keeps the system doing that. So, but you will not get this kind of critique from psychologists or psychiatrists, or you just won't get it even from most educators who teach children, because they want children not to be rambunctious in the classroom, right? And they just don't know how to deal with it. And you're right; they're ignoring the evidence, um, and it's a faulty assumption about human nature, which is a philosophical issue, right? What is a human being? This is a species typical functioning question, right? And it's easy to see it. Aristotle started this kind of reasoning when he said, what is the primary function, let's just say, of an organism? It's to live and reproduce, right? And okay, let's start even with the lowest ones, plants, right? What do they need? What do they need? They need sunlight and water and good soil, right? And if they don't get all of those, they don't flourish. So you've got a flourishing plant or a sick plant. What makes one or the other is whether or not the species typical characteristics are being given the nutrients that they need in order to flourish. So, okay, so plants need soil, water, sunlight. Animals need, food, shelter, sleep, etc. Humans, we have, the same nutritive function that plants do. We have the same other biological functions that animals have, but we're also rational social animals, right? So we need to have our intellect and our interpersonal skills, which are our virtues of character, right? Our moral and intellectual virtues need to be cultivated so that we are like flourishing plants, right? And if we don't get the right kinds of behaviors taught while we're in the formative years, we're going to be malfunctioning. And the way to fix that is not with medicine. In general, it's almost like half the population is being drugged. Not just children, adults too. You know what? I'm not so happy. Life lost its meaning. Things just don't taste the same for me. Let's give you some serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, etc. So all the children are on ADHD medication, and all the adults are on, I have a little depression and a little anxiety in my life. Here's some medication. This is a mistake. It's a good thing to suffer, really, occasionally, and say, why am I suffering? Because I'm not living properly. How am I not living properly? The person writing you a script is not trying to figure that out. The philosophical counselors, that's their job. To say, what's going on with you? What do you believe? Why do you believe that? How do you know that that's true? What's your hierarchy of values? Okay.
Of course, you mentioned Aristotle, and again, it goes back to those habits, and it starts in early childhood development. Aristotle said as also that we are what we repeatedly do.
That's exactly.
Excellence then is not an act but a habit. So
Exactly.
if a child has certain habits, they were not born with these habits, they have developed them.
This is the parental responsibility. Absolutely.
Correct. It's a parental responsibility. It's a co-joint also responsibility if that child does in fact experience schooling, is inside of some kind of an educational institution. The interesting thing also is that oftentimes in education, third grade is seen as the most important grade of an elementary school child. Why? Well, because at that time it's supposed to be the final year that the third grader is learning to read, after which the students are reading to learn. So it's not just that you're reading now, but now you're also reading to learn. And if you've not developed this habit by this time, by this grade,
then you don't have curiosity, which is essential. You don't have intrinsic interest, which is essential.
Curiosity, reading scores, developing this habit, to read, to investigate. Um, but also, what this does is it only continues if, in fact, the child does not develop this habit. It only continues to become um, further and further problematic. It only continues to further inhibit the child from progressing in all subjects. So it has an impact on all subjects. So
Not
not
only that, on the psyche too,
right.
because we need to be autonomous. We need to have some kind of self-regulation ability. We need to feel competent. We need to know that we have the power to act. So autonomy is connected with successful action performance, right? So if I don't read or write or even think well, I'm never going to cultivate competence. So I'm never going to have good self-esteem. And then the third most important thing, we need autonomy, we need competence, and we need connectivity. We are social beings. We need to be recognized by each other as being competent and autonomous, right? But you don't develop good connections if you don't have something good to bring to the table, to bond with others of like mind. So if you don't learn that in the third grade, yeah, you're gonna. And this is why you and I are both getting students in much higher grades who are missing so much, which is really sad. Um, and Ritalin and these drugs are for the kids are not the solution, and nor for the unhappy adults that they become. Um, they're a band aid. They're treating the symptom, not the cause. Oh, you muted all of a sudden.
Oh, of course.
There you go.
That is unfortunately the reality, because there is a certain very strong level of impatience by those individuals who do have the experience of um, either teaching, living with, or interacting in whatever way with that specific child. And I think that instead of those individuals to help the child to have better habits, to overcome these habits which are negatively inflicting the child, to create better habits which are going to help the child to progress, because the adults, they give up very quickly.
Yeah,
Because they give up very quickly, they want quick solutions,
absolutely. And
something that is going to help them deal with this child, but not necessarily how that's going to help the child,
same
because
thing
this
with the teacher.
lasts for a very short time. And so
Right.
then back again, this child has to continue.
Yeah,
Uh,
they are containing the problem, minimizing the extent to which it disrupts their lives, but they are not helping the child at all. You're absolutely right.
no, I mean, it's what I have, once, joked about, my wife, her sister, um, she's a medical doctor, and sometimes we joke and etc. So I said, so do you think that most medical doctors today are you know medical doctors that they seek to actually cure whatever it is that you're experiencing? So they give you step-by-step directions of how you can remedy um, your current situation by not continuing certain types of habits that you've developed that are helping you to digress? Or would you say they are doctors of prescription? Because those are two very different approaches.
And yeah, and I'm sure if she was honest, she said they are doctors of prescription, most of them.
So I mean, that's the that's the that's the unfortunate aspect of it. There is
Our
a
culture, it's
yeah,
cultural, yeah.
there is a American pioneer of surgery and medicine. His name is William Worrell Mayo. Um, he was basically the founder of the Mayo Clinic, and so Why do I say that he's a pioneer in medicine? Well, because if we talk about the medical practices um, in the early 20th century and maybe late 19th century, we gotta understand that he was a medical doctor that focused on treating the patients not necessarily with drugs, but by helping them to stay away from certain habits that are
Right.
inhibiting their progress. And
Right.
what he would even do is not just have excellent bedside manner, but also if somebody could not afford their medical treatment, because he also had two other sons that were training with him as well while he was conducting his medical work, he would give them the treatment for free because he understood that uh, he had he understood that it's his job to help the individual because he's in a field that's focused on helping the individual as a whole internally.
Exactly.
So it's not about money. It's
Yeah.
about being convinced that what
It's
you're
the same thing as a
you
teacher.
actually want to do.
Ed, it's the same thing as a teacher. When you have a student who's willing to take your help, you'll spend time with that person outside of your job hours, tutoring them, etc. But listen, it's been a great conversation, but we've gone over, and I have another meeting that's supposed to have started a couple of minutes ago. So, any last thoughts or word that you might want to have?
Um,
We can continue this conversation if you have a lot more to say. And I gather from the look on your face that you have a lot more to say. So let's have a part two about this soon.
sure, wonderful. Well, it's definitely been a pleasure, and I hope to speak with you again.
Oh, we will. Let's have a part two. We'll set it up through email shortly.
Wonderful.
All right, Ed, and have a great evening.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. You
Thanks
too
for
as well. Have a
thank you.
good night. Bye bye.
Goodbye.